This is part 2 of the story of the Hornet Air Group and the flight to nowhere. To summarize part 1, Bowen Weisheit had set out to find out what had happened to his friend Mark Kelly, a fighter pilot in the Hornet Air Group during the Battle of Midway, who was lost on a mission on the morning of June 4, 1942. Even though it was now 40 years later, Weisheit managed to track down and interview 5 of the pilots who flew in Mark Kelly's squadron that day, along with other pilots flying in the bomber squadrons. Besides learning about how the Hornet Air Group fell apart in the course of its flight, he also came to the stunning conclusion that the group had not flown a course of 240 degrees, as was given in the after-action report, but had instead flown a course of 265 degrees, causing the Hornet Air Group to completely miss the Japanese fleet. Weisheit constructed his own version of a track chart, giving his best estimate of the route flown by each squadron that day. But is that chart correct? After all, it is based almost entirely on 40-year-old memories, which will have faded and become confused over time. That is what will be examined here. Let's begin with the torpedo bombers. On Weisheit's chart, VT-8 started flying with the Hornet Air Group on course 265, but after about a half hour, turned left by 30 degrees and headed down to the Kido Butai. What Weisheit's chart does not show is that there was a second squadron flying along with VT-8 that day, and that was Fighting 6 of Enterprise, VF-6, commanded by Jim Gray. When VF-6 departed Enterprise, it was supposed to join up with the rest of the Enterprise Air Group. However, Spruance had sent the dive bombers ahead without waiting, so when Gray took off, he was left to join up with just VT-6, the torpedo bombers, led by Gene Lindsay. Gray explained what happened in both Thaddeus Tullia's book Climax at Midway and in an article Decision at Midway. At first, Gray actually cited both Waldron's and Lindsay's squadrons. Lindsay had one less plane than Waldron. But Lindsay was somewhat behind, and over time his squadron diverged somewhat from Waldron's, although the divergence, quote, did not seem excessive. Eventually, Gray could only cover one, and he chose what turned out to be Waldron. According to Gray, Waldron, quote, headed for the Japanese fleet in a beeline, that is, up until a layer of cloud caused Gray to lose sight. Continuing on the same course, Gray spotted the Japanese fleet at a bearing of about 30 degrees off to his right. If this recollection was correct, it argues that the initial course of VT-8 passed just south of the Kido Butai, and a final course correction to the right was needed. For Tullia's book, Gray created a track chart showing the routes of the two squadrons. This chart appears to be derived in part from a track chart shown in Samuel Eliot Morrison's book on Midway, pages 118 through 119, which itself is based on the so-called Bates Report of 1948. Both squadrons are shown flying southwest from Task Force 16. Waldron followed the most northerly course, with Lindsay just to his left, diverging at an angle of about 4 degrees. The value of the course being flown is not indicated, but based on other tracks shown on the chart, Lindsay's course would have been of order 238, while Waldron's would have been of order 242. This track is quite different from Weisheit's. If Weisheit were to add the Torpedo 6 track to his chart, the two torpedo squadrons would diverge by at least 27 degrees, much greater than that estimated by Gray, and not matching his description. For example, the separation of the two squadrons would have grown to 7 nautical miles in just 10 minutes. Further, Gray's account is also not in accord with a 30-degree turn to the left 30 minutes into the flight. Finally, when Gray first started escorting Torpedo 8, the Hornet Air Group bombers and fighters would still have been flying above it at high altitude if Weisheit were correct. Yet Gray made no mention of seeing other planes, even though he was actively searching for the Enterprise dive bombers. The other description we have of the flight path of the torpedo bombers comes from George Gay, sole survivor of the Hornet-based VT-8, who, in a 1942 Life magazine article and a 1943 Navy interview, stated that Waldron flew, quote, just as straight to the Jap fleet as if he'd had a string tied to them, matching the description of Jim Gray. Gay also recalled that, quote, Lieutenant Commander Waldron told us that he thought the Japanese task forces would swing together when they found out that our Navy was there, and that they would make a retirement just far enough so that they could again retrieve their planes. Also, quote, he did not think they'd go on into the island of Midway, as most of the squadron commanders and air group commanders figured. When VT-8 did spot the Japanese fleet, Gay reported that, quote, the ships were moving away from Midway, as the skipper had guessed. The Japanese story of the Battle of Midway is contained in what is called the Nagumo Report, which is an after-action report written by Admiral Nagumo's staff and captured by the U.S. in 1944 on the island of Saipan. Part of the report is a detailed log of events during the battle, including the sighting of Torpedo 8's planes as they approached the Kita Butai. That portion of the log is shown here. Multiple authors have argued that this log is evidence that VT-8 approached from the northeast, supporting the idea that it initially flew a course of 265 before turning to the southwest. However, if one examines the log carefully, the story is quite different. For example, the first sighting is from Chicama, which reports a bearing of 52 degrees to starboard. If one treats this value as the true bearing, then yes, it is to the northeast. But since the course of Chicama at the time was 70 degrees, that would place the sighting on the port side of the ship, not the starboard. In fact, a perusal of the patterns and values of other sightings, including ones that include both true and port bearings, show quite clearly that these are bearings relative to the bow of a ship, and one needs to add the ship's course to get the true bearing. VT-8 was sighted to the southeast. Gray's track chart showed both Waldron and Lindsay making a right turn just before heading into attack, thus approaching from the southeast. Gray first sighted the Kita Butai off to his right and then needed to turn right to approach it. Note, however, that the proposed courses for VT-8 242 if Gray was correct, or 234 if Weisheit was correct, differ by only 8 degrees, whereas the two sightings given in the Nagumo report differ by 14 degrees, meaning that the Nagumo report is far too imprecise to distinguish the two. Now we come to the scouting and bombing squadrons. According to Weisheit's chart, Scouting 8 and Bombing 8 both flew for almost 2 hours on course 265, covering 228 miles, but making no contact with the enemy. What Weisheit does not show is the expected intersection point with the extrapolated line of approach known to Mitscher and Ring, which was at a distance of only 182 to 185 nautical miles from the launch point. Thus, Ring flew past the expected intercept point by 43 to 46 nautical miles. The average speed was about 115 knots. The maximum combat radius of a Devastator torpedo bomber was about 175 nautical miles. If Mitscher really did send the Hornet Air Group on course 265, it was guaranteed that none of the torpedo bombers would return. Would Mitscher really have done that? The dive bombers then turned south for maybe 10 to 15 minutes. At that point, according to the Hornet deck log, the Scouting 8 planes were low on gas and so likely dropped their 500-pound bombs and returned to the Hornet. This description matches those given by the two Scouting 8 pilots interviewed by Weisheit, Walter Rodee and Ben Tappan. The Weisheit chart shows that the return would have been about at a ground speed of 134 knots. But what about Bombing 8? With 1,000-pound bombs that were twice as heavy as what Scouting 8 was carrying, surely they too were low on gas. Now, one version of the story is that, being low on gas, they decided to head for Midway instead. The problem is that this story makes no sense. The distance to Midway was 243 nautical miles, longer than the distance back to their launch point at 228 nautical miles, and much further than where Scouting 8 would ultimately be recovered, 210 nautical miles. Yet, according to Weisheit, they actually decided to head southeast for nearly an hour, covering a distance of 135 nautical miles at a speed of about 150 knots, compared to a speed of about 115 knots on the outbound route. However, the Bombing 8 War Diary tells something different. The purpose of this leg was not to reach Midway, but rather to, quote, locate the enemy. In fact, the track would have crossed over the track of the Enterprise Air Group just after it had begun performing an expanding square search on its way to locating the Japanese fleet. It was only when Bombing 8 spotted Curry Atoll, according to the War Diary, or, quote, smoke from Midway, according to Stanhope Ring in his so-called lost letter, that they turned for the Hornet, a full hour after Scouting 8 had decided to return. The War Diary says that the turn back happened at 10:15. Weisheit's chart gives the time as being 25 minutes later. Due to alleged problems with the navigation beacon system, it was only then that, low on gas, most planes now turn for Midway, while one section of planes is able to pick up the beacon and return to the Hornet, landing just after Scouting 8 and still carrying its bombs in spite of having flown 65 nautical miles further. The total distance was about 509 nautical miles. That would seem to be well beyond the range of a SPD dive bomber carrying a 1,000-pound bomb, particularly considering that the Enterprise dive bombers flew less than 400 nautical miles and several of them suffered fuel exhaustion, although granted they were in combat. Neither Weisheit nor any other proponent of 265 seems to have noted, much less tried to explain, this utterly bizarre behavior. For the record, I reproduce here the VB-8 War Diary entry for the morning of June 4th. You can pause the video to read it in full. Weisheit asserted that, according to the Hornet deck log, Scouting 8 was detected at 11 a.m. on radar at a bearing of 260 degrees and distance of 56 nautical miles returning to the Hornet. If one were to backtrack that contact to 10:30, it would have placed Scouting 8 squarely over the Kido Butai at the time that Scouting 6, Bombing 6, and Bombing 3 dive bombers had just finished thrashing the Imperial Japanese Navy carriers, 3 of which were now flaming wrecks. Surely Scouting 8 would join in, right? In fact, it would be perfectly positioned to go after the fleeing Hiryu. Except Weisheit actually placed Scouting 8 on a bearing of 270, meaning it would have passed 24 nautical miles north of the action at 10:30. Surely Rodi would have seen the smoke from the Kido Butai, what with Zeros and Wildcats and torpedo bombers being shot down left and right, and, if he timed it right, carriers blazing away. Apparently not. The amazing performance of the bombers was, if anything, exceeded by that of the fighters. Outbound, the fighters flew 160 nautical miles. In spite of being low on gas, the section with Mitcher, Rouleau, and Gray was able to fly 275 nautical miles on the return. That is over half again as far. Furthermore, it did so at an average speed of 170 knots at an altitude of just 8,000 feet. Now, it turns out that 170 knots is just above the, quote, maximum range cruise speed for altitudes of 15 to 19,000 feet. This is according to a data sheet from the U.S. Navy Bureau of Aeronautics that I managed to dredge up. However, if you drop down in altitude, that optimal speed also drops, for example, going to 140 knots at 5,000 feet. You do gain some benefit from the energy recovered from dropping down in altitude, but if you run the numbers like lift to drag coefficients and all that, it's nowhere near enough to compensate. According to Weisheit, the fighters, low on fuel, were nevertheless draining it at an alarming rate. Then we come to smoke. Various pilots across all U.S. squadrons reported seeing smoke at some point, some stating that it came from the Kido Butai, but most claiming that it was from Midway, where some fuel tanks had been bombed. Now let's be clear, at the time of the sighting, no one could have known about the fuel tanks being bombed, so any assertion as to the cause of the smoke could only be based on information obtained after the fact. Within the Hornet Air Group, I am aware of 3 claims of seeing smoke: Clay Fisher, Walter Rodi, and Stanhope Ring. Clay Fisher, who flew wing on Air Group Commander Ring, remembered seeing smoke rising from Midway out of the left side window of his plane, and that he tracked it for about a half hour. On course 265, Midway would have been 176 nautical miles away, almost certainly too distant to see, and in the wrong direction. However, Ron Russell decided that Fisher might have actually seen smoke rising from the aerial combat around the Kido Butai, which was ongoing at the time, and which would have been in roughly the right direction. I estimate the distance would have been about 110 nautical miles when first sighted. Would smoke from a raging battle be comparable to smoke from burning fuel tanks? The carriers, by the way, had not yet been hit, so that's hard to say, but it's what would have been needed. Walter Rodi remembered seeing smoke from Midway as well, just before he began his return to Hornet. At that point, he would have been at a distance of 237 nautical miles from Midway, even more distant than Clay Fisher's sighting, and well out of range. He would have been just under 100 nautical miles away from the Kido Butai, and on a bearing close to that of Midway. So, could he have mistakenly seen that? But on his return, he would have had the Kido Butai in continuous view off to his right side, closing to within between 20 and 36 nautical miles, according to Weisheit, at 10:38, at which time there would have been 3 carriers burning furiously. Yet he didn't notice? Weisheit didn't even attempt to chart the route of Stanhope Ring, so we'll let it pass. Ring claimed to have seen smoke from Midway as well, just as he began his return. This is written in his 1946 so-called lost letter. And now we come to the most challenging task of all, fabricating a false track chart and accompanying narrative. Allegations of fabrication are at the heart of many a conspiracy theory. Usually the allegations are ludicrous on their face or soon fall apart due to internal inconsistencies. When fabrications do occur, they can be exposed when participants start giving contradictory explanations as to what has occurred. Do we have any of those conditions here? Comparing Mitcher's narrative with the track chart, there are no obvious discrepancies, although certain details, for example the story of the fighters, are wrong, albeit with credible explanations. The distance traveled by each group of planes was sensible, with required speeds of order 120 to 125 knots. After the war, in March of 1946, Stanhope Ring wrote an account now called The Lost Letter, in which he tried to correct the record regarding what happened during the battle, at least from his perspective. Rather than blaming Mitcher for sending the Hornet Air Group on a wild goose chase, Ring mainly repeated what Mitcher had written in his report, albeit with less detail, but repeating the observation that the Hornet Air Group had turned south at the point where Waldron and the Enterprise Air Group had turned north. Ring admitted that the turn south was based on his own faulty judgment. However, had he flown 265, one could have questioned many of his judgments, but turning south would not have been one of them. We do not know how the Hornet Action Report was created. It covered not just the events of the morning of June 4th, but also the events of the afternoon, plus June 5th and 6th. If the Hornet Air Group did indeed fly bearing 265, who came up with it and why? Presumably it was chartered by Stanhope Ring, but what did Mitcher tell him to use as an intercept point? Where did track 239 come from? The other squadron commanders? Who created the track chart? The track of Hornet itself presumably came from the navigator. The tracks of the other squadrons were an astoundingly complex tapestry. It is not something one could create on a whim from whole cloth. Was it created by Air Officer Apollo Susek? Air Operations Officer Foster? In other words, it has to have been a conspiracy among multiple officers on board the Hornet. What about the pilots? They all knew what course they were flying. What if any of them were to have an opportunity to read the report? Wouldn't one of them have cried foul? Or perhaps they were all in on it as well. Timing is also a challenge. Mitcher's communications with Spruance and Task Force 17 were spotty at best. According to the log of Air Operations Officer Foster, the Discovery report mentioning just 2 carriers came in at 6:23, only 30 minutes before the order to launch was received. Hornet apparently failed to pick up an earlier message with the same information. Thus, Mitcher had a very short period of time to come up with his plan to chase after the other 2 carriers, while at the same time getting a course to the ones he did know about would have been difficult enough. Had he anticipated needing a plan of action well in advance? It all seems very improbable. How solid is the evidence? In support of his proposal that the Hornet Air Group flew course 265, Bowen Weisheit presented fighter pilot John McInerney's account of turning back to return to Hornet as follows. Quote, significantly, he recounted that while turning, he saw smoke and what appeared to be units of the Japanese fleet far off to the south. The only problem is, if you read the transcript of his account, McInerney actually said the exact opposite. McInerney was flying west. Quote, because I swung to the right, that is north, and that damn, I could see some ships down there, a long, long, long ways away. No mention of seeing smoke. In an article published in May 2012 in Navy History magazine, Craig Simons described the evidence favoring course 265. His first example was as follows. Quote, when one pilot, Troy Guillory, initially said that the air group flew westerly, his interviewer, Weisheit, suggested that he must be mistaken, that the course was to the southwest at 239 degrees. No, said Guillory, we went the wrong way to start with, and pointing to the chart, to the 265 line. Sounds pretty convincing, right? No. Simons gives the impression that the word westerly is somehow inconsistent with the word southwest. However, Simons can also be imprecise. For example, in describing the path taken by the bomber squadron, Simons wrote, quote, Ruff Johnson peeled off from the formation and turned south, even though Johnson actually went southeast. When Guillory stated that, quote, we went the wrong way to start with, he was not responding to an assertion by Weisheit that it must have been 239. In fact, that was an assertion Bowen never actually made. In fact, right after making that statement, Guillory followed with, be it 240 or 265. The wrong way was in reference to the target that they were given. Quote, and that never was the Japanese carrier fleet. It was another fleet. And, quote, we were given the wrong position and went to where the support ships were, not where the carrier forces were. Guillory said that he learned about the wrong position from reading Walter Lord's book. But the only other Japanese force that had been spotted at this point in the battle was the occupation force, which was hundreds of miles away to the west of Midway. Nevertheless, in an attempt to, quote, lead the witness, help refresh Guillory's memory, Weisheit noted that the support ships were, quote, back a bit further from the carriers. In other words, closer to the 265 line. Never mind that these support ships did not exist. Having been fed this fabrication by Weisheit, Guillory then pointed to the 265 line. Great work, Craig and Bowen. Guillory was one of 3 witnesses who allegedly saw Waldron brake to the left when he departed the Hornet Air Group. Here is the quote cited by Ron Russell, quote, and then Waldron broke off to the left. What Russell did not do is quote the statement made by Weisheit immediately preceding, which was also, quote, and then Waldron broke off to the left. Once again, Weisheit was, quote, leading the witness. Guillory was merely parroting the words of Weisheit, which proves nothing about what he thought he actually saw. Then we have the radar operator, actually the Air Operations Officer Foster, on board the Hornet, who recalled tracking the air group as it flew away from Task Force 16 and, according to Simons, said that, quote, it had flown outbound on a course of 265 degrees. However, according to Weisheit, Foster only said, quote, on a heading of almost due west, and that Weisheit should contact Walter Rodee, commander of Hornet's scouting squadron, to get the exact course flown. Foster never said the course is 265. Finally, why would Walter Rodee remember course 265 after 40 years? Whether or not he had written it down in his flight log, as alleged by some, he had no need to consult it when first asked the question by Weisheit. He immediately responded with 260, 265, and not 240. I am no memory expert, but one thing we can do is look at the record. Rodee flew 4 missions over 3 days during the course of this battle. For the first 3, Stanhope Ring was the air group commander. For the final mission, however, Rodee served as air group commander, meaning that he was the one who would determine the course that the group would fly. What course was that? 264. All in all, the evidence for course 265, already a bit sketchy being based on 40-year-old memories, becomes much weaker once you look in detail at the arguments people have made in support over the years. It requires one to ignore statements made by actual witnesses much closer in time to the events that occurred, requires planes already low on fuel to fly at gas-guzzling velocities, implies that squadron commanders made bizarre decisions, requires pilots to be eagle-eyed over long distances but myopic when looking over short distances, and requires everything to have gone so wrong that 3 squadrons came oh so close to the Japanese fleet, but only one actually found it. In conclusion, it is unlikely that the inconsistencies in the different accounts will ever be resolved, so the course flown by the Hornet Air Group will always remain a bone of contention. In spite of that, Weisheit did discover, as well as one could possibly expect, what had happened to his friend Mark Kelly, and he filled in many of the gaps in our knowledge of how the Hornet Air Group fell apart on the morning of June 4th, 1942.